Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Adam Golov, Marketing and Communications Manager at Data Conversion Laboratory, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I want to let you know we'll allow time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. So please write your questions in the chat area as they come to mind. If we don't have time to answer them all, we'll make them available on our website. For those of you who are not familiar with DCL, we convert and organize content to create electronic documents, populate databases, publish on the web, and basically get it ready for tomorrow's technology. DCL services help you refine your document conversion strategy, identify document redundancy, extract metadata, and transform legacy and future documents for real needs, today and in the future. Today, we are thrilled to introduce Ishita Grover of Cisco Systems. And without further ado, welcome, Ishita.
Thank you, Adam. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here presenting to you about content audit. As I get started with my presentation, just a quick background in terms of who I am and what I've done. I've been part of Cisco for 12 plus years. Before that, I was at Veritas, Symantec, and I've also taught technical writing, content management at San Jose State for about 5 to 7 years. And here I am after a decent amount of time dabbling with content and various aspects of it. What I am going to share today are some of the lessons I've learned over the years working with content and leading product user content across several channels, across several media, exposed to different audiences. And what are some of the key differences that come to light when you do a content audit, when we do get into knowledge management, when we start looking at content as a whole, trying to work through silos and trying to understand what the content landscape looks like in each of our organizations. So when I started putting this presentation together, the question that came to mind was, what does it take to effectively implement a content audit, and what does it really look like when it's in place, when you have actually implemented it? And the two key criteria that feed into a solid content audit plan are managing knowledge and timely support for readers. These are two main aspects or two main components that one has to always have a clear picture of as you proceed with doing a content audit. At a high level, I'd like to cover what your content landscape might look like, what are the different drivers for knowledge management or information management. In today's day and age, no content strategy is complete without thinking about social media. And then we get into a content audit, where you're at and how do you get to what your goal is, and what's involved in forming an action plan. And like Adam mentioned, we'll have some time for questions, and please feel free to ask as we get through the presentation. So to start off with, the first thing I typically want to discuss is what is the content landscape that you're exposed to? Are you the only content generator in a company, in an organization? Are you involved with or are there more people in your organization that are creating content? At least in my organization, in the company that I'm working at Cisco, there are several functions, several teams, several people that create content. One of the things that we realized very early on in our careers as writers or content professionals is that pretty much everyone likes to write, and even if they don't like to write, there's a certain aspect of their job that requires them to create content. So at the start, we have people who create marketing content to sell a product or sell a service. There's people who then create sales collateral to sell the product, to cater to certain audiences. There's technical writers who create end user documentation for actually learning how to use the product. There's professional services who are focused, a group that's focused on specific customers and create content for that specific customer for using a product or a service. There's support. There's people who have to address trouble tickets or product issues that they need to address and handle, and they create content for for the specific customers that they're addressing for troubleshooting certain issues that they might be running into. Technical marketing typically comes in where they write white papers, deployment guides, or even sometimes licensing content in terms of how licensing works. So there's, and there could be a few more in the organizations that you guys work, that you all are part of, or there might be some less, a few people, fewer than these kind of personalities who create content. The part that I have found interesting is that for every group that creates content, the subject of the content is common. It's just that they write with a different intention. They create different personalities of content for the same product or the same service. That's kind of how I look at it. Now, is there an opportunity to leverage each other's work? Absolutely, there is. The question is how quickly or how easily can you work through those silos. The reason I'm talking about the content landscape is because if you as a content creator or me as a content professional, if we don't understand who all are creating the content, it becomes really difficult to actually do a content audit, because many a times you might just be creating a content audit plan just for your area of expertise, your content of expertise, but those practices might not be able to satisfy the needs of someone else's content. And in light of, and in doing so, what happens is, from a customer's perspective, their user or their reader experience is not going to be consistent. So whether or not your content audit plan can be used by them, or whether they can use it or they cannot use it, I think that's besides the question. The point that we have to keep in mind, or I like to keep a focus on, is can we make it so that having knowledge of that content in itself, how does that feed into creating your content audit plan? That's the reason why I typically give a decent amount of focus on understanding who are the different parties and different functions that are creating content, and what kind of content are they creating. Then the second aspect to this is knowledge management. When we talk about knowledge management or information management, I focus on the knowledge experience or the information experience from a reader's perspective. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of content management systems, because I think that's a little bit of a tangential topic given what we're discussing today, but more from a reader's perspective, from your customer's perspective, who's actually people who are reading the content that's made available to them, whether it's through your company's website, whether it's through social media, whether it's through whether it's Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whatever other social media portals you're using to advertise your product or your services. So knowledge management drivers, the way I look at them, are comprised of product and related content strategy. So it's very important to understand what's the foundation of the product life cycle, what's the product roadmap, because product or service roadmap, because the execution plan for product development is born out of the roadmap. How does product strategy allow the business to zero in on specific target audiences, which then goes into audience analysis or persona analysis? Product strategy also draws focus on product and consumer attributes. Is this a business-to-business situation we're talking about, or is this a business-to-customer, etc. Those are things that we typically should keep an eye on when we are discussing content strategy related to the product strategy. Then we get into audience or persona analysis. It's really important to identify some of the key segments of the product consumer. Who are your key consumers for a product? Is it a specific geography? Is it a specific age group? Or is it a specific area where a specific audience where they are focused on a specific product, or is it a life-changing? Is it something that's going to impact your buying decisions? Those kind of things is where audience analysis comes into play. It provides audience analysis will also provide insight into the user's motivations and many a times even the pain points. For example, iPhone X was just launched. It's $1,000. How many of us will actually make that plunge, and how many won't? Is iPhone 8 going to suffice if we don't get the iPhone X? Those are some of the questions that come into play. Content and personas are aligned with the stages of the buying cycle. So I wouldn't really care to have a car seat anymore. I have my child has grown up and I don't need it. But on the contrary, the next gen car seat is going to be more applicable to new parents. So those are some of the things that that a company has to think about when they do audience or persona analysis. Customization or personalization, these are things that come into play. For example, if you think about the custom page experience, for example, Facebook, all the feeds that you see on your Facebook page are things that are relevant to you, or the feeds are born out of your relevant searches that you had done in the past. So that's where customization comes into play. Search, as we all know, is key these days. Yes, navigation on a portal, navigation on a website is important, but at the same time, we all know that most people will start their search from Google or some other search engine. And how does your page or how does your information rank when it comes to a search engine activity? And above all, and the reason why I have governance and content inventory and audit highlighted is because that's going to be the focus of my talk today. Without any set guidelines and best practices around governance and content inventory and audit, it becomes really difficult to manage your knowledge portals. It becomes really difficult to manage how information is being digested by your users, by your readers, by your consumers. So hence the need for governance, the need for a content audit, the need for making sure you have inventory of the content you, your team, your peers are creating. There are multiple knowledge portals and not just your organization's website. So one of the things that I have realized is that when I do a content audit, it cannot be just for the main portal that I post my content to. Many a times there's content marketing techniques put in place, in which case an article that I wrote might be shared on Facebook, it might be shared on Twitter, it might be shared on LinkedIn. So the question is, when I make a change, how do I make it so that other areas or other portals where my content was shared also reflects the changes of my content audit? Or is it not important? Maybe it's okay for it to stay the way it is. But it is important to keep in mind that a content audit just for content showing up on your company's website is not enough. You have to keep in mind what your social media strategy is for the company, for the product, for the service that you're working for. So what is involved in your social media strategy? You have to have a clear definition of business objectives. What are you targeting? Who, again, which audience are you targeting? Is it a specific country? Is it a specific geography? Is it a specific age group, like I talked about? If you're on LinkedIn, you're targeting mostly professionals. You're targeting mostly people who are in the business. You are targeting probably C-level consumers. But if you're trying to sell the latest pair or the latest, greatest brand in sunglasses, you would probably think about Facebook or Instagram, or for that matter, I think there's Pinterest. So there's different social media portals that you can utilize to your benefit. Again, that feeds into identifying your audience. Where is your audience? Like the other day, my 14-year-old tells me, Facebook is for adults. It's for you guys. It's not for us. So that tells me that most of the youngsters the young adults are no more on Facebook. They're somewhere else. I think Instagram is something that they're heavily using. Competitive analysis. What are your competitors doing? Are they are you doing all the things that they're doing and more, or are you just about matching up to what they're doing? It's important to keep an eye on what your competition is producing and where they're publishing. It's important to figure out what your primary and secondary channels are, because that's the only way you will know where to focus your resources. Content governance, best practices, guidelines for posts. What happens if there is a negative post? What happens if someone actually went in and an outsider probably went in and put up negative information or wrong information for users who are using your products? What do you do then? How do you figure out budget? Nothing happens without money, so you have to figure out, how do you make a case for budget allocation for managing managing the social media strategy for a content audit. And then, of course, assignments and roles. We have to put together certain people who will be in charge, or who will have the responsibility to drive some of these changes, who will be responsible for defining what the strategy is going to look like. So that's what comprises your social media strategy. And with that, I'll go into what a content audit is like. So with content audit, I think these are the 5 pillars as I look at when I start to work on a content audit plan. First of all, before you get into an audit, it's important to have inventory. You have to know what's out there, what was created, and typically you will have an inventory based off of your CMS can probably give you that information. Any file system that you're using to store your content can give you that information. And of course, if you have some sort of an information architecture around the content that you've created, you will have a good sense of what's out there. So it's important to have inventory of what content is available. And then when you start to work on a content audit, the first pillar is unchanged content. What content should be kept as is, where there isn't any change required, even though it was created a year ago or 2 years ago, it still stays, it's still relevant, it's still important, and you would make that assessment based on the product strategy or service strategy that you're working for. That typically includes, unchanged content typically includes conceptual and descriptive information. So for example, if you're describing a certain product or describing a certain feature or describing a certain aspect of a service, that probably hasn't changed. For example, I get it, product specifications, release versions, if you're working in high tech or software industry. Those are things that probably won't change. But like I said, given the fact that I spoke about product strategy, you have to keep that in mind before, as you jump into a content audit. You have to keep in mind what your product strategy, what your product roadmap looks like. Both of these things work together, your product strategy and your content audit. So what I'm trying to say is that content strategy was born out of product strategy. So your content audit works hand in hand with your content strategy as put in place with the product strategy. So it's kind of important to keep that relationship in mind. You cannot do a content audit with no knowledge of what the product roadmap or the service roadmap looks like. How much content do you need to rewrite? What if things change? What if there was a certain feature description that kind of evolved into something else? What is it today? Did we miss this piece when we were first writing we were writing descriptions for the release in the first place? Did something change from the time it was written to now? How do you, what parts of your content need to be rewritten? This also includes adding new information or updates. It includes, for example, enhancements made to existing product functionality where, for example, a certain feature was released a certain way, but over the course of the past 2 months or 3 months, the functionality has kind of been enhanced, it has improved, so we have to go back and rewrite that information. Or to start off with, you did not have enough time to do the due diligence of making sure every aspect of that feature or that functionality was covered. So now, so that it is robust, you go in and enhance that information, and that would fall in the rewrite category. So restart, reuse of content chunks. If those of you who are familiar with data, many a times I call this abusive reuse, whereas where people are just reusing content over and over again without really paying attention to what's going on, what is actually part of that content. Sometimes a chunk is really not just a paragraph, it could be a whole page. Now, how many times does every writer do the due diligence of reading through every single word or every single paragraph of that page of content and to reuse it? Oftentimes it's, oh yeah, I've seen this before, let me just go ahead and add it. And what happens with that over the course of a few months is that people just add to it without doing the due diligence of reading through it on an ongoing basis. So that's content that will need to be rewritten. Archival and removal. Removal usually doesn't happen. I don't think there's any industry where you can just go ahead and delete content because of because of several legal agreements that we are in with our customers and partners, where you can't really delete any content. You are, unless of course that is wrong content and it won't be used at all, in which case you probably can delete the content. It'll be more of a siloed decision where a writer decides that this content is just garbage, or this was trial content that I was putting in place, in which case you can delete the content. But typically it's archival when there is an end of life or end of sale situation, which is where you go ahead and you have to figure out guidelines in terms of archival of content. Content applicable to a past release or a version. Again, maybe this release is not that widely used in the field. Maybe this part of the service that you're writing for is not really applicable anymore, but it was applicable in the past, but not so much anymore. So that is a use case for content archival. Content in file formats that are no longer in use. No longer in use. So for example, files which were in Word 1.0, maybe they're not applicable anymore, but you have to make sure that that content, if it's applicable, does get ported over to the new file formats and the old file formats are stored away. These are some of the things that we have to keep in mind with regards to archival and removal. I do give this archival and removal are things that I give a little bit extra thought to, because you don't want to delete your content and then realize that, oh my gosh, this was really important. Merge is where existing information can be brought together, whether it's through navigation or curation. So many a times, technical documentation has a lot of touch points with support content because they're creating troubleshooting content, or there's there's situations where a white paper or deployment guide was very close to what technical documentation wrote. So what are the touch points? How do we bring this content closer by curating it so that it's easily accessible from either location? That's what merge typically involves. And then there's gap analysis to figure out, okay, I completely forgot I needed to write this content, or one of my customers is using feature A and feature C, and we didn't really think about that combination. How do we make it so that they do have, we give them that sort of content that addresses that need? So these are the different aspects of a content audit, and believe it or not, each one of them needs you have to put in the due diligence of thinking through for each aspect of these for deploying a successful content audit. Oops. This is a pictorial version. I just put the different aspects of a content audit together so that, with some extra information, your information architecture, which covers a taxonomy, the structure, metadata, reuse, these are the different components that will come into play. Subject matter sources, when you're deciding on a content audit, you have to make sure that all key players are involved in the decision, whether it's development or marketing or sales, support. The last thing you want for them is to go to a certain bookmark that they had and suddenly they find the content has changed or is removed. Metrics, it's very important to keep an eye on, what your customer sat says, what is your feedback from social media, what are your web analytics, and what's the kind of cost that's going into implementing something like this. Style consistency, you want to make sure what you're doing in videos is consistent with your written word. You have to make sure that what your product manager has said in a data sheet actually jives with what your social media page says. Those are some of the things that you have to keep in mind in terms of style and consistency. Alignment with business processes. Compliance is a big deal for most of us in the industry, even more so with healthcare. You have to make sure that you have all the compliance criteria thought through. You have to make sure all certifications are kept in mind. So this kind of highlights some of the key aspects in addition to the previous slide in terms of what's required in a content audit. So what did you find out when you actually went through a content audit? What was then and what is now? This is why I called my presentation Unfolding Secrets, because you actually realize where the product was and when you first started and where it is now. You realize there are areas that need more information. You realize there's information that's repeated, that's redundant, and probably not needed anymore. It shows trends in your content. It shows some hot sinks, heat sinks, as I would put it, areas which need more attention, where you probably bypassed certain critical points. Areas or a certain page is getting negative attention because the way the information was written was not correct. And you might even see unique writing styles. Maybe you have a large team of writers, or you have different people who are writing to the same page. For example, there's the whole collaborative authoring that has a huge role to play these days. And you will notice that people have very unique writing styles, in which case putting a style guide in place or some sort of governance around that becomes even more critical. So what's involved in an action plan? To start off with, always make sure you have a goal in mind. What is the definition of what are you trying to achieve? What's the purpose? What are you trying to get out of a content audit? And why is it important now? What changed? Are you, one of the examples for a goal for a content audit is, are you looking to raise customer sat? By what percentage? You know, typically your leadership, your management will probably be able to give you a sense of, hey, we're looking to do this with our content marketing goals, or user content goals. How do you want to impact that? Timeline. It's really important to keep in mind from when to when. From, do you want to go back a month? You want to go back a year? You want to go back 2 years? You want to make, how much of your content do you want to go put through a content audit? Strategy. How do we get from point A to point B? And, what's going to be involved? This is where knowing your product roadmap, knowing your audience, knowing your goals that product marketing has set in place is going to be critical. And of course, you have to keep in mind that there will be challenges and there will be issues. So always making sure that you factor that buffer in when you plan your execution. So that takes me to execution, where you're going to create a project plan with milestones and deadlines, where your buffer is going to come into play. And also tracking progress on an ongoing basis. Make sure you have some cadence of a meeting with the team on an ongoing basis, maybe weekly, maybe bi-weekly, depending on how fast you have to achieve your goals. Or what's the time, how much time you have been allocated to carry through this, through the content audit. Metrics. As you are making progress, are you measuring what you're doing? If you have revamped a certain post on social media, or you've revamped a certain document, have you started to see increased traffic? Or no, it really didn't change anything. Or no, actually no one's coming to this site anymore. So what are you doing? So it's always important to make sure that there is staggered progress. You're posting things on an ongoing basis to make sure that you are achieving your goals slowly but surely, instead of boom, one day you have all content, audited content available on your sites, and suddenly there's you're in for a shock. Maybe if everything goes well, your traffic has increased and people totally love what you've done, but the downside to it might be that this is not what they were expecting. So checks and balances are important. So it's important to make sure that you're delivering your content audit results, or results of a content audit, in terms of different content pieces being posted on an ongoing basis. Start small and grow as you make progress. So in my experience, it's always a good idea to conduct a content audit as part of your daily work, instead of carving out time and saying, okay, 2 years from first launch of the product, I'm going to do a content audit. I think it's always a better idea to do it on an ongoing basis from the start. You can use tools which help you track defects. There are portal analytics that you can leverage from to give you a sense of how well your content is doing. There are tools that help you manage your vocabulary and general language metrics. So it's important to keep in mind that it's always a good use of your dollars if you can invest in tools that can help you with some of these to gain this kind of information. And then there's general housekeeping, where you're using the analytics that you collect towards creating clean and healthy content. So that brings me to my questions slide. Adam, it's with you.
Great. Thank you, Rashida, for a very formative webinar. The first question that has come in is, should I use a consultant for such an activity or someone in-house? And if so, what are the pros and cons for each?
In my opinion, of course, like you said, both have pros and cons. Going with someone on the outside, the benefit I've noticed is that there isn't any emotional attachment with the content. People will generally give you a very practical approach. They will tell you this is good and this is not. That is one of the biggest advantages because, in my opinion, most people have an emotional connection with the content they write. They really do feel that their content is most important. So it's difficult for most writers to kind of take that unbiased approach and say, okay, I need to let this go. But on the contrary, there's, if you do appoint someone in-house to do it, they are most familiar with the content. So they have better history with the content. They obviously have better relationships with the different cross-functional teams that they need to work with. So you kind of have to pick what's a better which solution is going to work better for you.
Great, thank you, Rashida. The next question that's come in is, how do you get buy-in from stakeholders to invest the necessary time and resources for a content audit?
So I would fall back on analytics. I would fall back on metrics. I typically have gone back to my management and said, these are the issues I am seeing with my content that is being read by consumers, by our customers, by our partners, and these are the issues that we are running into. The content is old. It needs to be worked on because it's projecting a negative image of the product overall. And you have to use some of those reasons. And bottom line is, if you have the data and the analytics to show what you're talking about in terms of negative feedback or reduced traffic, those kind of will always get your management's attention.
Great, thank you. The next question that's coming in is, can you cite some challenges that might impede progress of such a project?
Some of the challenges, one of the biggest challenges, ongoing release or ongoing work. Typically, writing teams or content teams are challenged with just keeping up with ongoing release work or ongoing activity. Hey, this new product is coming. Hey, this new release is coming. So everyone's just focused on the next new thing. It's very hard to kind of work that time into people's schedule and say, okay, from this week on, every Wednesday or every Friday, we're going to devote 2 hours to this activity. That is my biggest challenge that I have run into, is just carving out time for maintenance work. It's just super challenging because, like I said, everyone's just focused on doing the next new thing. So the one approach that has worked for me is where I set up time on people's calendars and say, okay, this week for the next 3 weeks, these 2 hours, we're going to just go back and look at our content and see what needs to be done with regards to a content audit. So long story short, in my opinion, the only way you can be true to yourself and be true to a content audit is just keep doing it on an ongoing basis. I know it's hard, but that's the best way to do it.
Great. Thank you, Rashida. The last question that has come in is, are there any insights into B2B versus B2C content audit exercises?
So B2B, interestingly, needs more content audit, or I should say attention overall, as compared to B2C, because B2B content is the subject matter expertise really does lie with the staff that's working with the product or is in-house to the company. B2C, interestingly enough, a lot of people contribute to the content. Hey, my Yahoo Mail is not working on my iPhone. What do I do? So there's a lot of people outside in terms of collaborative authoring who are posting that kind of content. So that, from that perspective, B2B certainly needs a lot more attention. That's one big thing that I have noticed.
Great. Thank you, Rashida. And thank you, everybody, for attending today's webinar. This will conclude today's broadcast. You'll be able to access the recorded version in the archive section of our website. Also, our next webinar will be Thursday, October 19th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, titled Identifying Plagiarized Images in Journal Submissions, being presented by Mark Gross, President of DCL, and Ari Gross, CEO at C-Vision Technologies. Thank you everyone for attending, and have a great day.